You need to leave the country club. Members don't come here looking like you." The sentence landed with the weight of a verdict, slicing through the quiet clubhouse so sharply that even the clink of crystal glasses seemed to disappear. At exactly 9:18 on a bright Saturday morning, beneath polished oak beams and walls lined with championship photographs, every conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the entrance where a black woman in a navy polo shirt, simple white golf skirt, and well-worn golf shoes stood holding nothing more than a leather scorecard holder. Richard Coleman, the club manager, remained behind the reception desk with his chin raised and arms folded across his tailored blazer, speaking loudly enough for every member enjoying breakfast to hear. He wasn't whispering. He wanted witnesses. The woman simply looked back at him without blinking. Her name was Naomi Brooks, 44 years old, calm enough that the silence surrounding her somehow became louder than Richard's voice. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Brooks. She had arrived alone that morning by design. No luxury SUV waiting outside. No assistant carrying her clubs. No recognizable designer logos. Her golf bag rested quietly on a small push cart, the kind any weekend golfer might own. She greeted the receptionist with a polite smile only moments earlier and asked for access to T1 under her reservation. Everything about her appearance suggested an ordinary golfer enjoying an early round. That was precisely the point. Naomi had spent years believing the true character of an organization could only be measured when no one believed they were being watched. Richard looked her up and down once more before taking a single step forward. "This is a private club," he announced. "Members don't bring outsiders dressed like that into our clubhouse." A low murmur spread through the breakfast lounge. Several white members exchanged knowing glances. One elderly gentleman frowned but remained seated. A younger couple looked away, pretending not to notice. Near the fireplace, a woman quietly lowered the newspaper she'd been reading, sensing something deeply uncomfortable unfolding. Naomi answered in the same steady tone she had used since walking through the front door. "I'm not bringing anyone. I'm here to play golf." Richard gave a short laugh that carried no humor. "Then you're at the wrong place." His words drifted through the room like smoke. A man wearing an expensive golf jacket smirked into his coffee before muttering just loudly enough for nearby members to hear. "Public courses are 10 miles east." A few restrained chuckles followed. None of them knew that every careless word was slowly becoming evidence of something much larger than an argument at a reception desk. Naomi neither defended herself nor matched their hostility. She simply rested one hand on the handle of her golf bag and watched Richard with the patience of someone who had seen this scene before in different cities, different buildings, and different decades. Richard mistook her composure for weakness. He leaned closer across the polished counter. "I'll say this one last time," he declared. "Walk out now before security has to escort you." The room became so still that even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than before. And without anyone realizing it, the entire future of the country club had already begun changing with that single sentence. No one moved. The silence inside the clubhouse stretched so long that it almost became uncomfortable to breathe. Naomi Brooks stood exactly where Richard Coleman had ordered her not to stand, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her golf bag, her expression unchanged. She neither apologized nor protested. Instead, she looked around the room with quiet curiosity, as though she were studying far more than the polished floors and antique trophies decorating the walls. She was studying people. Their reactions mattered more than Richard's accusation. Years in business had taught her a lesson that balance sheets never could. Buildings revealed architecture. Markets revealed opportunity. But people revealed themselves the moment they believed someone beneath them had no power. Richard interpreted her silence as surrender. He straightened his blazer and smiled with growing confidence, convinced the confrontation had already been won. "Well," he asked loudly, "are you leaving? Or do I have to make another phone call?" Naomi answered with the same calm voice that somehow forced others to lower theirs. "I have a reservation." Richard shook his head before she could continue. "Not anymore." He reached across the reception desk, tapped several keys on the computer, then looked back at her with visible satisfaction. "Whatever reservation you thought you had doesn't matter now." The receptionist sitting beside him hesitated. Her fingers remained frozen above the keyboard. She had watched Naomi arrive barely 5 minutes earlier. The reservation had appeared perfectly legitimate. Yet Richard's authority inside the club was rarely questioned. She quietly lowered her eyes instead of speaking. Around the breakfast lounge, whispers spread from table to table. Some members watched openly while pretending to sip coffee. Others leaned toward each other, exchanging assumptions before learning a single fact. She probably booked under someone else's name. Maybe she's from one of the public courses nearby. This place has standards. Every careless sentence floated through the room, reinforcing one another until prejudice sounded almost reasonable to those determined to believe it. Naomi heard every word. None of it surprised her. She had walked into boardrooms where investors assumed she worked in catering. She had attended charity galas where hosts asked her which celebrity she represented. She had stood beside billion-dollar projects while strangers searched the crowd for the white executive they believed must be in charge. None of those moments had broken her. They had educated her. She glanced toward a wall covered with framed photographs documenting decades of club history. Every championship team, every former president, every smiling committee, hundreds of faces. Almost none looked like hers. She wasn't offended by the photographs. She was interested in what they represented. Tradition was a beautiful word until people used it as another name for exclusion. Richard noticed her looking around. "Admiring the place before you leave?" he asked with a smug grin. Naomi turned back toward him. "It's a beautiful property." "Exactly," Richard replied. "Which is why we protect it." His choice of words lingered in the air. Protect it. As though the greatest threat to generations of carefully maintained fairways stood quietly before him, carrying a golf bag instead of a weapon. Across the room, a young employee arranging scorecards slowed his work. Something about the woman's composure unsettled him. Most people embarrassed in public became defensive, angry, emotional, or simply walked away. Naomi did none of those things. She watched. She listened. She remembered. It was the behavior of someone gathering information rather than losing an argument. Richard finally sighed with exaggerated impatience before reaching for the telephone sitting beside the reception computer. He pressed a single button without taking his eyes off Naomi. "Security," he said, his voice firm and deliberate. "I need someone at the front clubhouse immediately. We have an individual refusing to leave private property." Several members nodded approvingly. Others shifted uneasily in their seats. Somewhere near the windows overlooking the first fairway, an elderly golfer quietly removed his glasses and stared more carefully at Naomi's face, feeling an unexpected sense that he had seen her somewhere before. The words "security is on the way" echoed through the clubhouse with unsettling finality. Richard Coleman slowly placed the telephone back onto its cradle, as though the matter had already been decided. His posture relaxed. His confidence grew. In his mind, the woman standing before him had already lost. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she was. She did not grip her golf bag more tightly. She did not raise her voice. She did not search the room for sympathy. Instead, she quietly adjusted the cuff of her sleeve and looked through the enormous windows facing the first fairway, where the morning sunlight rolled gently across perfectly trimmed grass. The scene outside was peaceful. Inside, the atmosphere continued to harden. "She's making this harder than it needs to be," one member whispered. Another shook his head. "Some people just don't know when they've worn out their welcome." A few nervous laughs followed. Others remained silent, sensing that something about the confrontation felt increasingly uncomfortable. Near the fireplace, the elderly golfer who had been studying Naomi's face leaned forward in his chair. He could not explain why her expression seemed familiar. He had seen that quiet confidence somewhere before, not on a golf course, but somewhere connected to business, perhaps on television or inside a financial magazine. The memory lingered just beyond reach. Behind the reception desk, the young receptionist swallowed nervously. Richard's actions no longer felt routine. She glanced once more at the reservation system still open on her monitor. Naomi Brooks. Confirmed tea time. Full member access. The information had not disappeared. Richard had simply overridden it. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She considered speaking. She remained silent. Across the room, the young employee arranging scorecards quietly stopped pretending to work. His attention never left Naomi. He had expected anger by now. Almost anyone else would have argued, demanded a manager, threatened a lawsuit, or stormed out in frustration. Naomi did none of those things. Her composure wasn't passive. It was disciplined, almost practiced. It felt less like someone enduring humiliation and more like someone allowing events to unfold naturally. Richard mistook that restraint for fear. He stepped around the reception counter until only a few feet separated them. "You still don't understand," he said firmly. "This club is private property. Membership here means something." Naomi met his eyes without hostility. "It should," she replied softly. "Membership should mean character." For the first time since the confrontation began, Richard's smile faded. The answer unsettled him because it contained no insult, no accusation, no visible anger. It simply held up a mirror. Before he could respond, the front doors opened. Two uniformed security officers entered the clubhouse at a brisk pace. Their arrival drew every eye in the room. Conversations stopped completely. Richard immediately lifted one hand toward Naomi. "That's her," he announced. "Escort her off the property." The officers approached professionally, neither aggressive nor apologetic. The older of the two offered Naomi a respectful nod before speaking. "Ma'am, we've been asked to remove you from the premises." Naomi looked at him with calm understanding. "Have I threatened anyone?" "No, ma'am." "Have I damaged any property?" "No, ma'am." "Have I refused a lawful instruction from someone authorized to make one?" The officer hesitated. It was an unusual question. Richard interrupted before either guard could answer. "You don't need to debate this. Just remove her." His impatience was becoming impossible to hide. Around the room, several members nodded in agreement, eager for the uncomfortable scene to end. Others shifted uneasily in their seats, no longer certain who deserved their support. The elderly golfer suddenly stood from his table. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi's face as an old memory finally began to surface. Years earlier, he had attended an investment conference where a keynote speaker had received a standing ovation after transforming one of the country's largest hospitality companies. The woman standing before him looked remarkably like that executive. His heartbeat quickened as the realization refused to fully form. Meanwhile, Naomi calmly released her golf bag and folded her hands in front of her. "I understand you're only doing your jobs," she told the security officers. "So before anyone touches me, let's make absolutely certain everyone in this room understands exactly whose property they're standing on." Neither security officer reached for Naomi. The older guard kept his hands respectfully at his sides, his instincts telling him this situation deserved caution rather than force. Richard Coleman took their hesitation as defiance. "What are you waiting for?" he demanded. "Escort her off the property." His voice echoed across the clubhouse, but something had already changed. The certainty that had filled the room only moments earlier was beginning to crack. A few members who had quietly supported Richard now exchanged uncertain glances instead of confident smiles. Near the fireplace, the elderly golfer remained standing, unable to take his eyes off Naomi. There was something unmistakably familiar about her calm expression. It wasn't simply confidence. It was recognition waiting to happen. He searched his memory, replaying business conferences, magazine covers, interviews, until one distant image stubbornly refused to leave his mind. Behind the reception desk, the young receptionist glanced once more at the reservation system. She had tried to convince herself she must have made a mistake, but the screen told a different story. Naomi Brooks. Confirmed reservation. Full member privileges. Every authorization remained valid. She quietly opened the account details, scrolling a little farther than before. A small notation caught her attention. Executive access. Her breathing slowed. She clicked again, only to find additional corporate authorization codes she had never seen assigned to an ordinary member. Before she could read further, Richard looked over his shoulder. "Emily," he said sharply, "close the reservation." She froze with her hand resting on the mouse. "Sir, the system." Richard interrupted. "I said close it." Reluctantly, she removed her hand from the keyboard without deleting a single record. Across the lobby, whispers became noticeably quieter. The young employee arranging scorecards could no longer ignore the strange feeling growing inside him. He reached into his pocket and unlocked his phone. A memory had surfaced only seconds earlier, a business article he had read while applying for a management internship. He searched quickly. Brookstone Hospitality, Golf Acquisition, CEO. Within moments, a photograph appeared on his screen. He stared at it, then slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi. The hairstyle was different. The clothing was simple, but the face was unmistakable. His heartbeat quickened. He looked back at the article once more before whispering under his breath, "No, it can't be." At nearly the same moment, the elderly golfer finally remembered where he had seen her. 3 years earlier, she had delivered the keynote address at an investment summit he attended with his son. She had spoken about transforming golf into a place where opportunity mattered more than appearance. The standing ovation afterward had lasted nearly 2 minutes. His expression changed instantly. He stepped forward, his voice calm but urgent. "Richard." The manager barely turned his head. "Not now." "Yes," the older man replied firmly. "Now." The room fell completely silent again. "Before you ask anyone to lay a hand on that woman," he said, never taking his eyes off Naomi, "I think you should find out exactly who she is." Richard let out a dismissive laugh. "I already know everything I need to know." The elderly golfer slowly shook his head. "No," he answered. "You've only decided who you think she is. Those are two very different things." The words settled over the clubhouse with quiet force. For the first time since the confrontation began, doubt spread through the room faster than judgment. And Naomi Brooks simply stood there, saying nothing at all, allowing the truth to move toward them one realization at a time. Richard Coleman gave a dismissive smile, convinced the room was finally returning to his side. "You've caused enough of a scene," he said. "Leave now, and we can all move on." Naomi Brooks looked at him quietly, then let her eyes drift through the clubhouse windows toward the rolling fairways glowing beneath the morning sun. For a brief moment, everything around her disappeared. She was no longer standing inside Willow Ridge Country Club. She was 12 years old again, sitting beside her father in an aging pickup truck parked outside another golf course many miles away. They had arrived before sunrise, carrying a second-hand golf bag held together with worn stitching and determination. Her father loved golf, but there were courses where he knew they would never truly be welcome. Still, he believed the game itself was worth loving, even when some people made it difficult. That morning, he had gathered enough courage to ask whether they could buy a bucket of practice balls. The employee behind the counter barely looked at them before answering. "This facility is for members." They accepted the answer with quiet dignity and turned back toward the parking lot. As they walked away, Naomi heard laughter behind them. "People like them always think they belong everywhere." She stopped walking. The words stung more deeply than she could understand at 12 years old. Her father noticed the tears beginning to form, but never turned around to argue. Instead, he placed his weathered putter into her hands. The grip had been wrapped twice with black athletic tape after years of use. He smiled gently and said something she would carry for the rest of her life. "Never waste your strength asking someone else to open a door they already decided to close." He paused, looking across the distant fairway beyond the fence. "Build doors that stay open for everyone who walks through them with respect." That single sentence quietly shaped every decision Naomi would make over the next 3 decades. She didn't set out to own golf courses because she wanted power. She invested in them because she remembered how exclusion felt from the outside of the gate. The memory faded as naturally as it had arrived. Naomi found herself once again standing inside the clubhouse, facing Richard. Nothing in her expression had changed. If anything, she looked even calmer. Richard mistook her silence for defeat. "Last chance," he said confidently. "Walk out with your dignity." Across the room, the elderly golfer watched Naomi with growing concern. The young employee still stared at the article on his phone, now completely certain of what he had discovered. Emily, the receptionist, quietly looked from Naomi to the reservation system and back again, realizing the truth was already sitting on her screen while almost everyone around her refused to see it. Naomi reached into the pocket of her golf skirt. Richard smirked. "Planning to call your lawyer?" he asked. Naomi removed her phone without answering. She tapped one contact at the top of her screen. The call connected almost immediately. "Good morning, Grace," she said, her voice as calm as if she were confirming a meeting. There was a brief pause before she continued. "Initiate Protocol 7 for Willow Ridge." Grace did not ask a single question. "Understood, Ms. Brooks. Protocol 7 is now in motion." Naomi thanked her softly and ended the call. She slipped the phone back into her pocket before looking at Richard once more. He gave a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Was that supposed to scare me?" Naomi answered with complete composure. "No." She paused just long enough for the silence to settle over the room. It was simply the most respectful way to make sure the truth arrives before anyone here makes a mistake they can't take back. For a moment, nothing happened. Richard Coleman allowed himself a small, confident smile, convinced the mysterious phone call had been little more than a desperate bluff. Around the clubhouse, several members relaxed, believing the uncomfortable confrontation was finally coming to an end. One man quietly muttered, "I knew it." Another returned to stirring his coffee. Richard looked toward the security officers. "You can finish your job now," he said. Yet neither officer moved. It wasn't hesitation born of fear. It was professional instinct. Naomi Brooks had remained respectful from the moment she arrived. She had never raised her voice, never threatened anyone, and never resisted a lawful request with hostility. Something about the situation no longer felt routine. Then a soft notification sounded from the reception desk. Emily instinctively looked at her monitor. A message appeared across the top of the screen. "Corporate account verification in progress." Before she could react, another notification replaced it. "Administrative permissions are temporarily under review." Emily clicked the reservation system, but several management functions had become unavailable. She frowned, confused rather than alarmed. "Richard," she said quietly. Without looking at her, he replied, "Just clear the reservation." "I can't," she answered. "The system isn't letting me make changes." Richard walked behind the desk himself and reached for the keyboard. He entered his administrator credentials with practiced confidence. The system paused for a moment before displaying a simple message. "Access temporarily unavailable. Please contact corporate administration." Richard frowned. He tried again. The same message appeared. His confidence began to fade, although he refused to show it. At that same moment, his phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed the regional operations office. He answered immediately. "Richard Coleman." A calm voice responded. "Richard, this is Daniel from regional operations. We've received a request to verify activity at Willow Ridge under Executive Protocol 7. We'd like everyone to pause any further action until our review is complete." Richard glanced toward Naomi before lowering his voice. "This is just a misunderstanding." "Perhaps," Daniel replied professionally. "That's exactly why we're verifying the facts first. Please don't remove anyone from the property until we finish reviewing the situation." The call ended. Richard stared at his phone for a second longer than necessary. Across the lobby, members noticed the change in his expression. The certainty that had defined him all morning was beginning to disappear. Meanwhile, Emily refreshed the reservation page. Naomi Brooks' profile remained active. Every authorization was still valid. Beneath the reservation appeared a corporate designation she had never noticed before: executive access. Her eyes widened. She looked toward Naomi, then back at the screen, unsure whether to believe what she was seeing. The young employee still held his phone displaying the business article. He no longer doubted himself. The woman standing quietly in the clubhouse was the same executive who had appeared on the cover of a national business magazine after leading one of the largest hospitality acquisitions in the industry. The elderly golfer folded his arms, saying nothing. He understood exactly what was happening. The truth wasn't arriving with dramatic speeches or flashing alarms. It was arriving the way real truth often does, one verified fact at a time. Naomi remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, her posture relaxed, her expression calm. She neither celebrated nor interrupted the unfolding process. She simply waited. Richard slowly lowered his phone and looked directly at her. For the first time since ordering her to leave, there was no arrogance left in his eyes, only uncertainty. And somewhere beneath that uncertainty came the first unmistakable realization that the woman he believed had no place inside the clubhouse might actually hold more authority than anyone else in the building. Richard Coleman slowly lowered his phone after the call from regional operations. The confidence that had carried him through the morning was gone, replaced by a silence he could no longer control. Every person inside the clubhouse watched him, waiting for an explanation he could not yet give. He looked back at Naomi Brooks, searching her face for uncertainty, frustration, or satisfaction. He found none. She stood exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, composed, and impossibly patient. "Who are you?" Richard finally asked. It was the first genuine question he had asked her all morning. Naomi looked at him steadily. "I was hoping you would ask that before deciding I didn't belong here." The words carried no bitterness, only quiet disappointment. Richard swallowed hard. Regional operations. Why would they get involved because of you? Naomi remained silent for a moment, allowing the question to settle over the room. Then she answered with complete simplicity. Because this property reports to my office. Richard frowned. What does that mean? Naomi took one slow step forward. You keep calling this your club. She paused. It has never been your club. Another pause. No one moved. No one spoke. 11 months ago, Brookstone Hospitality Group acquired Willow Ridge Country Club as part of a national hospitality expansion. Richard stared at her, saying nothing. Naomi continued in the same calm voice. I reviewed the acquisition. She paused once more. I approved it. The clubhouse fell into complete silence. The young employee slowly held up the business article on his phone. The headline matched every word she had spoken. The elderly golfer closed his eyes briefly, realizing his memory had been right all along. Emily looked at the executive designation still displayed on her monitor, then back at Naomi. Every piece finally fit together. Richard shook his head almost instinctively. No, he whispered. That's impossible. Naomi met his eyes without changing her expression. No, she answered gently. It's simply unexpected. She nodded toward Emily's monitor. My name has been in your reservation system since the day the tee time was confirmed. She then glanced toward the championship course visible through the clubhouse windows. Every fairway you can see. Every green. Every employee working here. Every improvement plan for this property is part of a company I have the privilege of leading. Richard's shoulders slowly dropped. The weight of his assumptions became impossible to ignore. Naomi took another measured breath before speaking one final time. When I walked through those doors this morning, I wasn't asking anyone for special treatment. She looked around the room, making brief eye contact with the members who had laughed, the employees who had hesitated, and the security officers who had remained respectful. I expected the same courtesy every guest deserves. She turned back to Richard. Instead, you decided who I was before learning my name. Richard lowered his eyes. No defense came. No excuse followed. The room remained perfectly still. Naomi's voice softened even further. You weren't trying to remove a stranger. She paused, letting the silence do its work. You were trying to remove the owner from her own golf course. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction interrupted the moment. Only quiet disbelief settled across the clubhouse as every assumption made that morning collapsed under one undeniable truth. In that silence, everyone present understood the real revelation was not that Naomi Brooks owned the golf course. It was that respect should never have depended on discovering she did. No one spoke after Naomi's final words. The silence inside the clubhouse felt different now. It was no longer driven by judgment, but by realization. A few moments later, the front doors opened once again. This time, the people entering were immediately recognized by several employees. Daniel Foster, the regional vice president responsible for Brookstone Hospitality's golf division, walked in alongside the company's regional human resources director. Neither appeared rushed. They had clearly been the closest corporate executives available after Executive Protocol 7 had been initiated. Daniel approached Naomi first, offering a respectful smile. Good morning, Ms. Brooks. Naomi returned the greeting with a polite nod. Thank you for coming, Daniel. He looked around the clubhouse before speaking. Our team completed the initial verification during the drive over. The reservation, executive credentials, and property ownership have all been confirmed. No one in the room questioned him. The uncertainty that had filled the clubhouse only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. Daniel turned toward Richard Coleman. His voice remained calm, professional, and free of emotion. Mr. Coleman, effective immediately, your managerial authority is suspended pending a formal corporate review. Richard stood motionless. Daniel continued. This is standard procedure whenever Executive Protocol 7 involves allegations of discriminatory conduct or serious violations of company policy. An independent investigation will determine the final outcome. There was no dramatic accusation, no public humiliation, only a professional process unfolding exactly as company policy required. Richard instinctively reached for the employee badge clipped to his blazer. Before he could say anything, Daniel gently extended his hand. I'll need your access badge, please. Richard hesitated for only a second before unclipping it and placing it into Daniel's hand. The small plastic card that had represented his authority moments earlier now felt unexpectedly light. Daniel handed the badge to the Human Resources Director, who documented the transfer without saying a word. Nearby, Emily remained behind the reception desk, watching quietly. Naomi noticed the concern on her face and walked over. "Emily," she said warmly, "I know today wasn't easy." Emily lowered her eyes. "I should have spoken sooner." Naomi smiled reassuringly. "You refused to alter the reservation when you realized something wasn't right. That decision mattered more than you probably realize." Emily looked relieved for the first time all morning. The young employee who had recognized Naomi from the business article stepped forward next. "I almost convinced myself I was mistaken," he admitted. Naomi nodded. "The important part is that you chose facts over assumptions." The older security officer respectfully removed his cap. "Ms. Brooks, I'm sorry you experienced this here." Naomi answered immediately. "You treated me with courtesy before you knew who I was. That's exactly how every guest deserves to be treated." The officer smiled quietly, grateful for the distinction. Daniel then addressed the members gathered throughout the clubhouse. "Willow Ridge Country Club will continue normal operations today. Tea times will proceed as scheduled. Over the coming weeks, every department, including management, will participate in additional leadership, ethics, and inclusion training. Our goal isn't simply to investigate what happened this morning. It's to ensure it never happens again." Several members nodded silently. A few who had laughed earlier now looked visibly embarrassed. No one attempted to defend what had taken place. Richard remained standing near the reception desk, no longer surrounded by confidence or authority, only by the consequences of decisions made before asking a single question. Naomi looked around the clubhouse one last time. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no desire to embarrass anyone further. Only the quiet hope that the lesson learned that morning would outlast the incident itself. Because real leadership was never measured by the power to punish. It was measured by the willingness to make sure the same mistake would never be repeated. The clubhouse gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. Conversations resumed in quieter voices. The laughter that had filled the room earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. Employees moved with renewed purpose, and members who had witnessed the confrontation seemed more aware of one another than before. Outside, the championship course stretched beneath the warm morning sun, its emerald fairways untouched by everything that had happened inside. Naomi Brooks stepped onto the stone terrace overlooking the first tee and rested one hand on her golf bag. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the course. In the distance, she noticed a father helping his young daughter adjust her grip on a golf club. The girl missed the ball completely, then laughed as her father encouraged her to try again. Naomi smiled quietly. The simple scene reminded her of another morning many years earlier, when her own father had stood beside her with an old putter wrapped in black athletic tape, teaching her that confidence could survive even where acceptance did not. She watched the pair for another moment before turning toward the first tee. Daniel Foster joined her on the terrace. "Everything inside has been taken care of," he said. Naomi nodded. "Good." Daniel hesitated before asking, "Corporate Communications is preparing a statement if you'd like one released." Naomi looked back toward the clubhouse, where members and employees were already speaking to one another with noticeably greater respect than when she had first arrived. She shook her head gently. "No statement." Daniel looked curious. Naomi answered with a faint smile. "If today's lesson matters, people will remember it because of what they witnessed, not because of what we publish." Daniel smiled in understanding. Some victories became more meaningful when they belonged to everyone who had experienced them. Behind them, Emily greeted a newly arriving couple with the same warmth and professionalism she had always hoped to show every guest. Nearby, the young employee welcomed another golfer without making assumptions about who belonged and who did not. The elderly member adjusted his cap before offering a friendly greeting to people he might have overlooked only hours earlier. The atmosphere had not changed because the building was different. It had changed because the people inside it had. Naomi placed her golf ball on the first tee and looked down the fairway stretching toward the horizon. Before taking her stance, she glanced once more toward the clubhouse. No one stepped aside because she was the company's chief executive officer. They stepped aside because they had finally learned the respect every person deserves before a title a resume, or a bank account ever enters the conversation. Naomi smiled, addressed her ball, and sent the opening drive soaring beneath the clear blue sky. The ball climbed high above the fairway before landing cleanly in the center of the short grass. She watched it disappear into the distance, then quietly continued her walk down the course. Behind her, the clubhouse doors remained open to every arriving guest. Ahead of her stretched 18 holes built for competition, but also for belonging. The events of that morning would eventually become another story shared among members, employees, and families. But its lesson would travel much farther than Willow Ridge Country Club. Success can be hidden beneath ordinary clothes. Leadership often speaks in the quietest voice. And the character we reveal before knowing someone's title will always say far more about us than anything we learn afterward. In the end, Naomi Brooks never came to prove who she was. She simply reminded everyone that dignity should never have to be earned before it is given.